Since the attacks on Paris on the 13th of November, the media has been saturated by coverage of ISIS, or Daesh as they should properly be called. The aftermath of the attacks and the panic that has spread throughout the US and Europe in the weeks that have followed have dominated the front pages. A number of trends in the coverage of the attacks are worth noting. Firstly, the contrast between the coverage of Paris and the coverage of the attack in Beirut the day before, where 43 people were killed and over 200 injured in a series of coordinated suicide bombings. The New York Times reported that Beirut, also the site of deadly attacks, feels forgotten, stating that for some in Beirut there was anguish that just one of the stricken cities, Paris, received a global outpouring of sympathy akin to the one lavished on the United States after the 9/11 attacks. The article states that the attacks meant different things in Paris and Beirut. Paris saw it as a bolt from the blue, the worst attack in the city in decades, while to Beirut the bombing was the fulfilment of a never entirely absent fear that another outbreak of violence may come. The independent Australian news site New Matilda ran an article by Chris Graham, "Paris attacks highlight Western vulnerability and our selective grief and outrage." He points out that the bombings targeted a predominantly Shia suburb, and not counting Israel's assaults on Lebanon, represent the deadliest bombings in Beirut since the Lebanese civil war ended more than 2 decades ago. He notes that the Beirut attacks warranted no live media blogs from Western media, no wall-to-wall media coverage. The Paris attacks prompted international grief. The colours of the tricolour were projected onto landmark buildings across the world. Support and sympathy poured in from statesmen from countless countries. Yet the attacks on Beirut went unmentioned. The New York Times piece quotes a Lebanese doctor. "When my people died, no country bothered to light up its landmarks in the colours of their flag. When my people died, they did not send the world into mourning. Their death was but an irrelevant fleck along the international news cycle, something that happens in those parts of the world. Civilians in Lebanon are not as newsworthy as Parisians in the City of Love." Al Jazeera's analysis article, just as innocent, comparing Beirut and Paris, outlines that where the Beirut bombings appeared in the news, reports sought to categorise Lebanese victims rather than mourn them. Compare the headlines of these two papers in response to the two attacks. In response to Paris, the New York Times ran with the headline, "Paris attacks kill more than 100, border controls tightened." Reuters ran with "Disbelief, panic as militants cause carnage in Paris." In response to Beirut, just 24 hours before Paris was attacked, the New York Times proclaimed on Twitter, "Deadly blasts hit Hezbollah stronghold in Beirut." And Reuters, "2 suicide bombers hit Hezbollah bastion in Lebanon." Referring to a civilian neighbourhood as any kind of stronghold is not intended to elicit either attention or empathy with the families who lost their loved ones. News of another attack was also suddenly widely circulated following the attacks on Paris, on a university in Kenya in which 147 people were killed. The BBC reported that the story attracted more than 10 million page views over 2 days. The strange thing was that the attack happened over 6 months ago, back in April. And according to the BBC, the story received a quarter of as many readers back then. As the BBC goes on, while some of those clicking on the story were mistaken about timing, others shared it to make a point. They were criticising Western media organisations for allegedly failing to cover the Kenya massacre as prominently as they covered events in Paris. Would that this were the most disappointing aspect of the coverage following the Paris attacks. Some surprising commentators, most notable Peter Hitchens in the right-wing Daily Mail, who wrote a piece called "Really Want to Beat Terror? Then Calm Down and Think." He called on readers to not forget that Islamist terror has grown in strength and reach, not diminished, since we embarked on our supposedly benevolent interventions in the Muslim world. He called for reflections before rash and aggressive responses were made, for people to think rather than shout. Rhetoric and militancy have not done very much for us in the past. Surprising as this was, it was far from typical in most of the responses. Predictably, many of the responses to Paris have played straight into the hands of the Daesh narrative, that this is time for declarations of war. Jeb Bush, reported on NBC New York, said, "We should declare war and harness all the power that the United States can bring to bear, both diplomatic and military, of course, to be able to take out ISIS. We have the capabilities of doing this, we just haven't shown the will." And indeed, declarations of war have followed. François Hollande, speaking to the French Parliament 3 days after the attack, was emphatic in his declaration that France is at war, as shown here by the FT. He even went as far as describing Syria as a factory of terrorists, as London's daily freesheet The Metro reported. And he is far from alone. Many have attempted to link the attacks to the migrant crisis which has dominated the European press lately. This is despite the fact that the named attackers were all European citizens, 2 French, 3 Belgian. Middle East Eye reported that Poland won't accept refugees after the Paris attacks. The European Affairs Minister for the right-wing Law and Justice Party said that Poland must retain complete control of its borders as well as its asylum and migration policy. Poland's foreign minister said Europe needed to approach in a different fashion the Muslim community living in Europe which hates this continent and wishes to destroy it. And if Europe has been a festival of reaction, the US has gone into overdrive. Donald Trump, already rabid in expressing his desire for the construction of a wall along the border of Mexico, protected by drones to execute those attempting to cross it, has stepped from the parodic caricature of the Republican right into outright fascism. He has declared that he would send Syrian refugees home, as this BBC article shows us. The New York Times reported that Donald Trump says he'd absolutely require Muslims to register on a database when arriving in the United States. This idea clearly further cemented by the attacks in Paris. The article states that when asked how a system of registering Muslims would be carried out, whether, for instance, mosques would be where people could register, Mr. Trump said, "Different places. You sign up at different places." Not only are comparisons to Germany 1932 far from far-fetched, Trump does not seem remotely fazed by them, as the New York Times article continues. Asked later, as he signed autographs, how such a database would be different from Jews having to register in Nazi Germany, Mr. Trump repeatedly said, "You tell me," until he stopped responding to the question. Jeb Bush, another hopeful Republican presidential candidate, called for a straightforward religious test for refugees, as reported by The Atlantic in its article Rejecting Syrian Refugees. He suggested constructing a system whereby migrants would be tested and only proven Christians would be allowed to enter. No surprise then that Democracy Now! Reported a disturbing increase in Islamophobia as US mosques are threatened and Canadian mosques set on fire. They reported that just hours after the Paris assault, a caller left a voicemail laced with racial slurs for the Islamic Society of Pinellas County in St. Petersburg, Florida. The caller left his full name and threatened to firebomb you, shoot whoever's there on site in the head. In the UK, attacks on British Muslims have apparently increased by 300%. The Independent reported that Muslims living in Britain have suffered more than 100 racial attacks in the weeks following the events in Paris. This comes from a report to the government's working group on anti-Muslim hatred. The article stated that most victims of the UK hate crimes were Muslim girls and women aged from 14 to 45 in traditional Islamic dress. The perpetrators were mainly white males aged from 15 to 35. The right-wing tabloid The Sun, meanwhile, never known to shy away from stirring up racist hatred, ran an article which claimed that 1 in 5 British Muslims had sympathy for jihadis. This claim has since shown to be emphatically not true. The Guardian reports that the Muslim poll faces growing criticism, with over 1,000 complaints made to the press regulator and readers of Muslim organisations accusing The Sun of misrepresenting the poll results. The Guardian states the poll actually shows that 5% of respondents agreed with the statement, "I have a lot of sympathy with young Muslims who leave the UK to join fighters in Syria," and 14.5% said they had some sympathy. As a result of the attacks in Paris, President Hollande has declared a state of emergency, with French Parliament voting to extend it by 3 months, as shown here by The Guardian. They reported that the government then intends to hold a special vote of Congress within 3 months to strengthen emergency powers in the Constitution. This would allow the state to immediately place under house arrest any person if there are serious reasons to think their behaviour is a threat to security or public order, an extended ability to carry out searches without warrants and to copy data from any system found. The Magistrates' Union issued a statement voicing concern that the state of emergency dangerously modifies the nature and extent of police and administrative powers. This is the first time a state of emergency has been enforced nationwide in France since 1961. As part of the state of emergency, the French police have also banned public gatherings, including demonstrations. A pro-refugee demonstration on the 22nd of November broke the ban and ended with riot police using pepper spray and batons against hundreds of pro-refugee demonstrators, as RT reported. Local police had notified the organiser that if the rally wasn't cancelled, they could face up to 6 months in prison. Among the quagmire of Islamophobia, state repression and calls for declarations of war on ISIS, it seems that one thing is obvious. More airstrikes on Syria will not only harm civilians living there, but will likely bring more terror attacks. Perhaps the most terrifying aspect of the latest escalations is the certainty that it will continue. Western governments will respond precisely as they shouldn't. We can be certain too that more civilian lives, not least in Syria, will be lost in Europe's rush to do Daesh's recruitment work for it. Muslims and Arabs, those within Syria, those attempting to take refuge from Syria in Europe and the US, and those who've never stepped foot in Syria in their lives, will continue to be the main casualties of violence from all sides. That much is heartbreakingly certain.